This week we'll be exporting our blocking shapes from Maya into ZBrush. We'll use Dynamesh and ZBrush to boolean our blocking geometry together. And then we'll go over some hard surface sculpting techniques. I'll go over some hard surface brushes, masking techniques, and deformation. Then we'll use the Decimation Master plugin to reduce our poly count, and we'll export from ZBrush into Maya. Once in Maya, we'll retopologize our sculpts using the Quad Draw tool, and then we'll model in some finishing touches to the meshes we've created. So this week I'm going to be taking this car body and doing some sculpting in ZBrush. So here in Maya, I'm just going to grab these three parts that are going to eventually be combined together, and I'm going to export them. And I'm going to export them as OBJ, and I'll just turn all this stuff off, and we'll just call this space vet body for ZBrush.obj. And yes, I'll replace it. The next thing I'm going to grab is just grab everything, and I'm going to export this as well. That's fine. And we're going to use it as kind of a template in ZBrush, so we don't go too far away from our proportions and lines that we've set up in the last lesson. So here we are in ZBrush. Let me go ahead and close this light box up. One of the first things I like to set up in here is this rectangle here represents the draw area, and I feel like there's this kind of wasted border around it. So one of the first things I always do is come over to Document and then change the width to about 1250 and then hit resize, and that kind of maximizes the space we have to work with here. So let me import our meshes. If we go to import here up to the scenes folder, and let's get the space vet body, and then we will just drag this out and hit T to edit, and now we kind of have this view of it. Hit F to frame up, and then let's in order to bring in the full model as reference, I'm going to need to go over to the subtool menu here, hit append this polymesh 3D, select it, and then when we hit import here and we go to space vet for ZB, and we're going to get this error because our model has n-gons in it. So let me just hit quads and triangles, and there we have our full model. So one of the strange things about ZBrush is that it's kind of this orthographic view that you can tumble around. Now, orthographic cameras in Maya are generally locked off, and you can't pan around something. So this is kind of a weird view to get used to. If we go to perspective, it's a little more like what we would expect to see in Maya. So you'll notice over here that our pieces on the right side of the model are all look like they're inside out. And what's going on there is because in Maya we had a group that with a negative scale on it, when we exported the OBJ, it kind of baked that negative scale into it. So what we're seeing is actually an inside out version of our meshes. Basically the normals are flipped. But that's okay. We're only using this body for reference, so we're going to be mostly working on this main body here. In fact, if we go to turn on transparency, it's basically a ghost version of itself. One of the other things I change right away is this red wax material. I usually will use basic material or basic material 2 when I'm sculpting. Just kind of helps me visualize things a little better. The other cool thing about ZBrush is you can do this see-through with the whole viewport, and that's going to be important when we load up our ref. So I've kind of placed the reference in this area of the screen, so when we load up ZBrush and turn on see-through, we can kind of try and line it up as best we can. But there's a problem with this, and it has to do with focal length. So unfortunately ZBrush doesn't have cameras in the way that Maya has cameras. We have basically one camera that we're looking through right now. And the unfortunate thing is that it has a different focal length than our camera in Maya. And not only that, the way that you adjust the focal length is in here, and it's this angle of view. Unfortunately, there's some sort of conversion going on here, and we can't just enter the 35mm that we had in Maya. But luckily, this artist here, Kyle Heffley, has worked on this problem and has a conversion chart between Maya's camera and ZBrush's angle of view. So if we look here, we can see 35mm in Maya equals 63.4 in the focal angle on ZBrush. So if we go back here, and let's turn our see-through on here, and then we go to draw and change this to 63.4, hit enter, we can actually line this up a little better. As you can see, the struggle is real here. So that's actually pretty close for the body, at least as close as I'm probably going to get it. You can see that some of the extremities here are not lined up whatsoever. And that's just kind of something that we're going to have to deal with later. But at least I can get a sense of where all these landmarks are. So one of the things I'm going to want to do next is save this camera view. And where I go to do that is under Document, Z-App-Link Properties, and then I'll just hit Custom One for this. So actually, let me open this side divider, and we'll close that. And if I drag this over here, now I can move around, and then if I hit Custom One, it'll go back to that view. So let's get into it. One thing I want to note before we move forward is that this custom view that we've set up, and if we do see through, it's still there. If you quit ZBrush, this is going to go away. So it's something you kind of have to get used to setting up over and over again if you do this in multiple sessions. That's why I always try to get into ZBrush and do my work and get out as soon as possible. I really have a love-hate relationship with this program. I think it's an incredible tool. It's got some amazing features, but some of the UI stuff is just really counterintuitive, especially if you're used to another package like Maya. That being said, they keep updating it. They're consistently making features better, even if sometimes it's more of like a workaround. But anyway, so we have these three shapes that we've created in Maya, and we want them to all be one shape that we can sculpt on. So how we're going to get this to happen is Dynamesh these pieces together. So if we go to Geometry Palette and we open up this Dynamesh menu, let's just see what the default settings get us. So if we go ahead and hit Dynamesh here, you can see that this is a big kind of ugly lumpy mess, but the idea is there. These pieces are all now one solid mesh. So let's hit undo. And let's increase this resolution to something like 1024 and hit Dynamesh again. So it looks like almost no change. We can see though that there's, if we get close, there's these transitions here between the pieces that we've put together. Let's look at the polyframe though. This is really dense, and it's going to be difficult to get some of these faceted panels to smooth together. So I'm going to actually hit undo once again, and let's put this resolution at 512 for now. And hit enter and Dynamesh. So this is going to be a lot easier to work with, and you're going to kind of have to gauge on your piece where the good place to be is. I'm going to put this rule of thumb out there. If you've framed up on your mesh and you can't see individual faces, you've gone too far and you need less resolution. So let me turn polyframe off here. So before I get into brushes, I'm going to point out the #1 reason that I like sculpting in ZBrush. And it's because I've done a lot of traditional sculpting. And the most powerful tool that we have in sculpting in 3D is symmetry. So if we go in here into the transform palette, you see there's a button called Activate Symmetry, and you see the letter X next to it here. If you hit the X on the keyboard, it activates the symmetry. You can change the axis of symmetry here. Since we're working with our car facing down the X-axis, you can see that X-axis symmetry is exactly what we're going to want. So let's get into some of the brushes we'll be using. The #1 brush that I use for hard surface sculpting is going to be the H polish brush. So it's right up here. And the cool thing about ZBrush is once you've selected a brush, it ends up putting it up here in the quick pick menu. So I'll be using that quick pick menu quite a bit. But anyway, H polish brush. So if we zoom into the surface here, you can see these faceted angles that we have. This size that we have here is a little too big, so I'm going to hold down the space bar and quickly adjust the draw size. You can also adjust it up here, but it's kind of quicker to just have the menu pop up. So now that we have a good draw size, I can kind of brush on here and you can see what it's doing. It's kind of averaging the normal between this face and smoothing it out. And since we have symmetry on, you can see it's doing it to both sides of the model. I'll use this brush a lot in making this mesh kind of smoothed out. The cool thing about it is that it kind of will respect this hard edge here. So if I use this brush against this edge, you can see that it's respected the curvature of that shape, but it's smoothed out kind of this plane of the surface. A more aggressive brush that does a similar thing that I'll use often is the Trim Dynamic brush. So this one is much more aggressive than the H polish brush. It does a similar thing, but you can see that the results are a lot less smooth. And what this is doing is every time we transition onto a new surface, it's recalculating the angle that it's going to be using. So you can see we get this surface that looks like it's been whittled with a knife a little bit. Another one that I use in this same family is the Trim Adaptive. And this one actually will kind of take the normal of a surface and it'll carve away at the other surfaces. So if I take this plane here of the door and I kind of carve away, you can see that it's continuing the surface of that plane. And this isn't necessarily what we want here, but it's a useful tool in some cases, and you might see me use it a couple times when I am sculpting on this thing. Obviously, with any of these brushes, if you hold the Shift key, it becomes the smooth brush. So I'm going to be using this a lot as well, and you can see right away that it's kind of taken away that whittled look of that surface and made it more of a smooth curved surface. So that's by holding the Shift key. One of the most important brushes to know in ZBrush is actually the Move brush. And that's going to be helpful in instances where I need to like refine this curve or something. You can make this brush extremely large and make large scale moves like that if you need to. I'm not going to recommend doing that, especially since we made our blocking model with our concept art lined up. But the Move brush is an important one to know. When I'm doing part lines, I like to use this Damn Standard brush. If we make this quite a bit smaller, it's like the standard brush, but it's got this sharp alpha here. If you draw on the surface here, you can see that it kind of carves a nice line into the surface. And this mesh is a little bit low res for this brush. Before we do our panel lines, we're definitely going to res up this mesh, but that'll be at a later time. And finally, the last brush that I really like to use is the layer brush. So what the layer brush does is essentially it adds a layer of digital clay depending on your Z intensity to the surface. So if we draw something like this, you can see that it hasn't built up much of the surface. But if we increase this Z intensity to something like 50, you can see that now we've really built up a layer of digital clay on the surface. Now the problem with this tool is if I wanted to continue this shape out, now you can see that it's kind of overlaps with the original shape and doubled up another layer on top of it. So one of the tricks I like to use with this tool is actually masking. So if we hold down the control key in ZBrush, we start to draw this gray on the surface, and that's a mask. So if I go with the layer brush over here, you can see that it ends on that mask. So a lot of times, like say for example, if I wanted to add a shape like those openings on our concept, I'll go in with the Control Alt key. Let me make my size a bit smaller. Go in with the Control Alt key and draw out the shapes I want. And then if I hold Alt with the layer brush, you can see that it carves in that shape. Now if I control drag out in the open, you can see that I've created this I've dug a layer out of the surface of the model. So that's really it in terms of brushes. I'm going to start smoothing out this surface. So let me get my H polish brush and we'll just get going here. I really like this H polish brush because I can sculpt along this surface and you can see how I'm affecting the curvature here. If I go ahead and smooth after using the H polish brush, you can see I get that nice curvature of that front fender there. So I'll use it for a little bit like this, and then periodically I'll go ahead and smooth out. So I switch between the two quite often. And you can see we're starting to get kind of a nice transition to the fender. The other thing is, if you start to get surfaces that look like they're kind of dipping in, you can hold the Alt key with the H polish brush and it'll kind of fill in the holes a little bit. These brushes all come in with like a default Z intensity. A lot of times I'll take that down, and it kind of helps me to be a little more sensitive to sculpting on some of these shapes. In this crease, I'll use the Alt modifier and kind of soften all these transitions here. Kind of a weird artifact back there from the Dynamesh. Sometimes if surfaces are close together, ZBrush doesn't really know what to do with them, so you get artifacts like that when you Dynamesh or Boolean or something. But it's easy to smooth out and kind of fix. Let me make my brush a little bigger. Okay, so you notice how I accidentally hit this focal shift? That happens to me a lot, and easy way to get around it is go back to reset current brush. Sometimes when you affect that focal shift, you'll get weird results out of your brush. Oh, the surface is looking a little lumpy, but we can easily go in with a smooth brush and kind of fix that. So another thing you'll notice here is we've smoothed out this surface, but we're still getting these weird kind of kinks from where the other surface is still faceted. So actually, if you go up to this edge with the H polish brush and kind of smooth that transition out, you can see that it's kind of affected the side view as well. So don't be afraid to go up to these edges and really smooth them out. So now you can see we've also lost some of that bumpy looking topology here as we've smoothed out each side of it. And that's kind of part of the process too, is eliminating those lumpy polygonal edges. I definitely want to fix this bottom edge of the car. Don't have to go too far because we're not going to be retopologizing any of the bottom of this shape. One of the things you'll notice with the smooth brush too, when you're holding shift down, is that the intensity is at 100. And a lot of times I'll take that down quite a bit, maybe to 25. And that kind of will help you to smooth the surface a little more gradually. I'm starting to kind of like that transition. You will notice though that I've created this kind of dip in the surface, and that's where the move brush is really going to come in. Just kind of correct it out a little bit. And the cool thing about this material in ZBrush, and sometimes I'll even switch to basic material too, it's got a little more specularity to it, is you can really see the transition of what you're doing. I like the idea of having more of like a ridge in the center of the car. I know though that on the Corvette it's a little higher. It's more of a ridge up top. Let's move on to the more of the top surface here. Now, you will notice on some of these transitions here how this is a concave surface, and as we get close to the edge with the H-polish, you can see what it does to this surface. So you're going to want to be careful in areas like that. That's why I will usually hit it with the Alt key and kind of smooth out the transition first. Or maybe even just the smooth brush and smooth those transitions that way. For a lot of times with these kind of tight squeeze areas here, I'll bring the draw size way down and kind of just focus on the facets themselves here. It's looking pretty good. Let me increase my draw size a bit to use the smooth brush. So let's work on this cowl now. This is kind of just a big round shape, so I'm going to hit it a lot with the smooth brush and kind of just smooth it all out. Now, this transition of the hood to the windshield is going to be something that we change in Maya, because obviously the hood is going to go over the glass, so we're not going to want this to be a super smooth transition here. So you notice as we smooth this surface out a little more that we're kind of losing this crease of this this fender. What I would do typically is we could use something like the dam standard and kind of redraw that in. But you'll notice I'm getting kind of this wobbly curve here. So one of the things that I like to use, especially with dam standard, is called the lazy mouse. And if we go to stroke, you can see this, there's this lazy mouse menu here, and it's already on for the dam standard, but it's kind of not really doing much for us. So I've adjusted the lazy smooth to all the way up, the radius to something like 30, and I brought the snap down to 20 or 19. And the step is actually going to repeat the brush alpha since we're in the dots mode. We don't want that. If we increase the step, it'll give us kind of this like dotted line. Let me just grab this real quick. And the cool thing about the lazy mouse is you can really go slow and get your line to be perfect. So if I then go and smooth with a small kind of brush size, go and smooth these areas kind of around this, we get that transition back a little better. So you can see now we've kind of gotten that transition back just by using the dam standard and smoothing. So this fender line is pretty sharp right now, but we're going to leave it because when we Dynamesh, it will kind of smooth out again. So one of the things I think would be cool is these front fenders have this kind of swooping curve shape, and I want to continue that back here, but I haven't really modeled it that way. So we're going to do a similar thing where we use the dam standard, go to the top view a little bit, just carve in, kind of mirror that shape. So this might be a good time to actually use like the layer brush just to carve away some of that shape. If I hold the Alt key, I can, and as long as you don't lift up your stroke with this brush, it'll stay along the same level. So that's kind of one of the cooler features of it. But you can see we've got like kind of a long way to go there. So I'm going to actually use the let's use the trim adaptive brush, go along this edge and kind of carve away. And so you're going to want to be mindful of some of the other planar changes that you're going to make with this brush because it's a very aggressive brush. So it's still a little ugly. Actually, let's go back to H polish and see what it does with this. The Alt key for some of the surfaces we cut into a little too much, and then H polish again. And what's cool about working on something symmetrical is you can kind of see different, you can see what's happening on both sides really. And the thing about this back area of the car is a lot of this is going to be cut out for that kind of engine bay area. So we can kind of just leave a lot of this as is and figure it out in Maya. So maybe we'll take the smooth back up to 100 here, just to kind of make quicker work of this windshield that's very faceted right now. Don't worry too much about the transition between the body and the glass, because that is definitely going to change. So you notice how I'm getting this kink in the highlight here, and I really want to use the H polish to kind of continue that kink on at like the right angle here. Yeah, I think this is starting to look pretty good. I'm getting pretty happy with it. Let's kind of examine what's going on with this weird transition here. And like I said, this area in particular isn't going to be in our final model, since this is where the engine bay is, but we can still kind of resolve it a little better anyway. So this back area really isn't getting the curvature I want, so what I'm going to do is actually use the move brush, kind of make this draw size a little bigger, and it's hard to see in that mode, so let's go this way with it. Kind of just move this area in, kind of give it more of a curvature. See, we can be pretty aggressive with that smooth, especially since the window is going to cut in around here. Let me get the H polish again. Getting some weirdness up here. Maybe it's time to bring the intensity on the smooth back up, just for this kind of short area here. Maybe we do want this to kind of transition like the front of the hood and make it kind of smooth out a little more. Let's get this kind of going. Oops. Draw size was a bit too big there. So now you can see we're getting some complicated surfaces here that would be a lot more difficult to achieve in Maya. So that's one of the benefits of using ZBrush, even though it is kind of a quirky program. So now I'm getting a shape I'm pretty happy with, actually. Let me actually work on this transition here. Make my brush quite a bit smaller. There's probably an argument for leaving this glass piece as a separate piece, but since I really want it to flow with the rest of the car, decided to kind of sculpt it all together, and then we can kind of create that recessed look of windshield at a later time. Okay. Then thing about this damn standard with the lazy mouse is you really want to do it like in one sweeping movement. So let me go ahead and smooth that transition out a bit more, and we'll notice as I kind of smooth towards the plane change, it's smoothing one surface and not the other. You could even go further and use the masking to do that. So as an example of that, if I wanted to really maintain this this edge, and let me get a really ZBrush kind of wigs out every now and again. If I really wanted to, oops, create this mask here, and then if you want to erase away a mask, use the Alt Control keys held down, but just the Control key will do the mask. So I want to get close to that edge, and then as we kind of smooth the surface and we get rid of the mask, you can see that it's a lot cleaner of a transition. We can do that over here as well. So I'm pretty happy with this shape here. Let me go ahead and save, and then we'll res this up and we'll move on to making some panel lines. So now it's time to add some detail to our sculpt, but first we're going to need to add some resolution. So if I click the polyframe here, you can see the current state of the resolution. And if I go to this Dynamesh window and increase the resolution to 1024, and then control click in the viewport, you can see that now we've doubled our resolution. And it looks like we got this little artifact over here. Let me just smooth that out really quick. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is use the smooth brush on some of these sharp corners. Since we have more topology to play with, we actually get much nicer smooth. I think if we had done this at the lower resolution, it would have been just a little too soft for this vehicle here. So let me actually get the H polish brush and fix this fender up a little bit. But you can see that with more resolution, these tools kind of do less for us because there's really less space for the topology to spread out. I'll smooth this transition around the window. So let's have a look at some of the things we're going to need to do here. Let's go to our custom view. So you can see we have these little holes in the front. We've got the wheel well, we've got the part line of the hood. We've got to kind of create these window shapes, and then the wheel well in the back and the scoop in the side of the door. So let's first tackle the window shape. And what I'm going to do is first mask. I'm going to mask the area around the window. And just gradually create this shape. Just create this shape and enough space around the mask. And then let's go to our custom view. And then we'll just kind of draw in, we'll align this a little better, and then draw in kind of where the window shape is on the concept. And we'll kind of rough in this this door jamb shape as well. And now that we kind of roughed that in, we can go in and refine the mask a little bit. For example, I'd like to kind of curve out some of these corners and make sure we've got a solid line for the mask. Now this line across the top, I really want it to be even with the door, so I'm just going to draw it straight across. You can see that when we drew the mask in perspective, we got this kind of weird arc shape. Now that I look at this, I'd like to kind of improve the shape of the window to kind of match that curvature, that door jamb shape. So I'm going to just H-polish and smooth like in the last video. And you can see we're going to kind of connect these corners of the door jambs together to kind of create more of a front windshield shape. But in the end, we'll still smooth it out so it's a little more bubble-like. Smooth it a little bit more there. I clean up that edge of the door as well. Let me fix these kind of puckered shapes down here and smooth the window out a bit more. So we have our mask drawn, but I'm going to want to work on this on a layer. And I like using the layers in ZBrush because it's kind of a non-destructive way of sculpting some of these features. If you want to take a step back on a certain feature that you're sculpting or redo it later, you can just dial the layer off. And let's go ahead and take the layer brush, and you can see that 50 is a little extreme, so I'm gonna take this down to like 25-ish. And you can see 25 is going to be a little more appropriate for the shape of the window. So let's just zoom out a bit, and we will sculpt down the full surface of the window in sort of one stroke with the layer brush. And smooth out some of these artifacts that we're getting. Kind of try to improve the shape of this window here. I'll even use like the trim dynamic and try different brushes here. Let's rename the layer windshield and turn off record. Now if I clear this mask, you can see that we've got a nice representation of our window for when we retopologize. And you can dial the effect of this in the layer, so if you feel like you've gone too far with something, you can always dial it down. Let's create a new layer and call it vents, and we're going to use that exact same workflow to get these vents on the front of the fender. So let me just draw a big mask that covers the whole area, and then we'll go to our concept view and kind of align things a little better. Let me decrease my draw size, and then I'll just Control Alt and draw away at the mask. Now you can see this isn't really aligned how I want, so I'm going to just kind of recreate these shapes where I think they need to be, and we'll just kind of keep refining them. And then we'll kind of have the top be straight across, and we'll have the bottoms kind of follow the angle of that fender a little bit. And then we'll clean up these rounded edges, but we can refine this even further when we're retopologizing in Maya. So if I then use the layer brush and kind of see what we're getting there. I'm not really happy with this angle here though, so I'm going to actually go back and kind of redefine the angle of these vents. Kind of just redefine their shape with a larger draw size. And as I said before, we'll further refine these in Maya. And I actually think that 50 isn't going to be strong enough, so I'm going to up the Z intensity to 75, because these are actually going to be holes in the mesh. And you can see they still line up with the concept pretty well. We use the move brush and kind of recreate some of the curvature. And now let's create a layer call it door scoop. And we're going to use the exact same method of drawing masks. We'll align this a little better, and then Control Alt to kind of draw the shape of that scoop out. So if I go to the side view now, I can kind of draw I can draw the shape out. Since I want this scoop to be kind of straight across the car, I can switch my stroke to drag rectangle, and we can get that straight edge here. So let me just overshoot the area that I want with the brush, and then come back and refine it. So you can see we're getting this weird artifact up at the top, and I think that's just something in the topology. It's making it just act weird. So I'm trying to use the trim adaptive tool here, but I'm not really getting the results I want. So what I'm going to end up doing is masking off the rest of the model and using the move brush and kind of making a big draw size, and then you can see how I'm using the fall off of the move brush to kind of create that gradual shape of the scoop. And then I can kind of just smooth out the transition. So one of the brushes that I didn't mention before is the pinch brush, and I'll use this sometimes when I want to really straighten out curvature of something. But you can see how it kind of has an effect on the surface, so I might do some back and forth here instead with the H-polish brush and try to get that as close as I can. This will be a much more refined shape when we're retopologizing in Maya, though. So I think this scoop is looking pretty good. Let me start drawing these masks for the wheel wells. So I'm going to try and align this as best I can. And we'll just really roughly put in this shape here, and then go to our side view and refine it a bit more. You can actually remove that mask from the around the window. And we're gonna want these wheel wells to kind of go around to the bottom, even though we won't be retopologizing any of the bottom. Just the way the fender's curve is gonna we're gonna want to have that information on the bottom. So let me create a new layer and actually call it wheel well. And I'm gonna keep adjusting this top edge here, and let's refine this shape of the front a little better. And then even fix the back a little bit. If we go to this masking palette, you can see we have a few tools here that are pretty handy. There are hotkeys for a few of them, but I find that if I want to do something specific, that I like to go to the masking palette and kind of just click the button of what I need. So you can see I did a quick invert of that mask, and now I'm looking at it through the concept cam. I'm seeing that this rear fender is a little bit needs a little bit more adjustment. So I'm just gonna go do that. And then we'll continue it along the bottom. So that's a little better. This needs to get a little bit closer to that top edge. Cool. So that's pretty close. So now I'm going to want to invert this mask, and if we use the layer brush, you can see that it's this kind of harsh transition. It's really essentially a 90-degree angle. But so what I'm gonna want to do is I'll invert the mask again and kind of blur it. And now you can see if we use the layer brush, we're getting kind of that nice smoother transition. But you'll notice I'm getting these weird artifacts when I go around corners with the layer brush. I think that's just the nature of what the layer brush wants to do. So I'm going to need to do something different here. So I'm going to actually open up this deformation palette, and you can see that we have a few things we could do. If we dial this offset, we kind of get what we're looking for, but not quite. So I think what I'm actually going to do is use the inflate. You see the results that we're getting with it. Let me undo that, and we'll just dial this out to kind of match the widest point of the little lip of the fender. And when we retopologize, we're not going to necessarily cover that entire surface, but you'll see when we get to that point. So now let me just kind of smooth out some of these weird artifacts that happen here. It's usually some kind of stray pixel on your mask, but it's pretty easy to just smooth them out after the fact, especially when we have a lot of topology. So let me clear my mask, and yeah, it's looking pretty good. Just kind of want to make sure you have record on when you're working on these layers. Just smooth out this transition a little bit better. And smooth out this transition. Kind of gets rid of some of the weird lumpy artifacts that we had, which are really just imperfections in our mask. So now that that's done, I think we can move on to doing some part lines. You can see we've got this part line of the hood and part line around the doors, which are really the only part lines we have to do. So let me create a new layer and call it hood, and we'll go ahead and grab the damn standard brush and just kind of start drawing that out. Make sure my layer is on record and just start drawing this out. So you can see that we need a little bit more Z intensity on this, up to 68. That's looking pretty good. You see I'm redoing this a few times, being slow and deliberate with the lazy mouse, but then when you hold down shift with your brush, it creates straight lines. So you notice I'm drawing this line and it's not appearing in this area around the window, and what that is it still thinks I have a mask on there. So even though it's not displayed, it's still acting like it has a mask. If that ever happens, the easiest thing to do is just control drag in the viewport and clear the mask. And that kind of let me complete that line. So let's create a new layer called door, and then we'll start drawing this part line for the door. And just kind of eyeball the center line of this door jamb shape. And I find that the lazy mouse really works best when you slow down and kind of take your time. So now I've brought that to this edge, kind of overshoot the edge a little bit. Now we'll kind of hug the shape of this fender. Actually, let's start from the bottom. Sometimes I find that it's easier to draw lines kind of from the bottom up. And just use the smooth brush anywhere you want to erase your damn standard lines. So I'm going to actually use the move brush and kind of refine the curvature of the fender just a little bit. And also kind of take that new part line we made along with us. So now I'm going to create this part line across the bottom. I'm not exactly sure why that wasn't working for me. You can see that this part line in front kind of cuts just behind the scoop. So let me recreate that kind of a look back here. I smooth out that just kind of slowly and deliberately make my way up there and kind of recreate that shape of the door that we had up there. Actually, let me redo that, get this curve a little closer to the curve of the scoop. Just take my time and go really slow. That's a little too close to that edge, I think. And cut across this way. Now I'll just bring that up to the top surface and meet up with the surface there. Extend this line of the hood. there's a couple more things to do. One is this door handle, which is probably going to move to about up there. And then you see this kind of grill just behind the hood, in between the hood and the glass. So we're going to cut out a little space for that as well. So let me now actually create this door handle, and we're going to create the door handle with the same masking technique as before. Actually, I think I want it to follow the outer curvature of this door a little bit. So let me just draw this out. And then we'll just go to our masking palette, invert the mask, and bring the intensity up to 50. And just carve away for the door handle. Let's go back to the hood layer, record on it, and then our dam standard again. And we will draw this shape that follows the window a bit. So that'll kind of be where those vents are, and they'll probably continue under the cowl, and we'll probably round the cowl out a little bit more, but that's that. That's looking pretty good. I think we can call it a day on sculpting. So I've pretty much sculpted in everything I wanted to sculpt from the concept art into this mesh. The next thing we're going to do is prepare it for export to Maya. So currently our mesh is 852,000 polys, which actually is pretty light for a concept model. A lot of times they're in the millions. Since this is a relatively simple model, we've been able to work on it and keep the poly count pretty low. Simple meaning there's not a lot of high frequency detail here. Even still though, we're going to want to get this into Maya at a poly count that's a little more manageable so that it doesn't slow down our scene as we start to retopologize. One of the great features of ZBrush is actually, and I'm going to close document up, if we go to Z plugin, there's this plugin in here called Decimation Master. And let me actually just drag this over here. What Decimation Master does is it kind of examines the mesh and looks at the surfaces, and it will take down the poly count, but you won't lose any of the forms of your model. So this is really going to be a visual process. The first step is to actually pre-process. So this will take a minute. You can see it says analyzing mesh here. But since we have a pretty low poly count, it'll go pretty quickly. If you're in the millions, this could take up to like 10, 15, 20 minutes. So now we've pre-processed it, and it defaults to 20%. Let's see what we get when we decimate to that level. So you can see that it's nothing has changed here. If I Control Z and do the polyframe, if we then hit the decimate button, you can see what it's doing. It's taking the forms of the mesh and it's triangulating them for one thing, but the broad smooth surfaces get larger faces while the areas of detail kind of retain a high poly count. We could even go further than this though. Let's go down to like 5% and see what we get. Turn off polyframe because we want to make sure that we're not going to lose any of our detail here. Let me decimate to 5%. You can start to see this look happening. This kind of looks like to me like hammered armor or something, but a lot of our part lines and details are still there, so this is probably actually pretty good. And you can see we're only at 49,000 polys, which is really light. So I'm actually happy with this. Let's look at the polyframe. And you can see what it's done here. All these broad, smooth surfaces get these large faces, but the areas of detail still retain like this kind of higher poly count. So with that, we're going to want to export this as an OBJ. But there are some settings in here under export that we're going to need to change. we're going to want to make sure that merge is turned on, and we're going to turn off group. If you leave group on, it'll basically export your mesh in a bunch of little pieces, and when you import the OBJ, it'll be a bunch of separate shells. So we're going to want to make sure that's off. So with that checked, let's export. And then in scenes, we'll go space vet body for Maya.obj and save that out. So let's get back into Maya and import our sculpt. So we'll go File, Import, Space Vet Body for Maya. And the first thing I'm going to do is stick it on a layer and call it Sculpt. And this way we can easily toggle the sculpt on and off as we're retopologizing. So let me hide these old body parts, and let's cross-reference this against the concept. So everything looks pretty close. The only thing that really sticks out to me are these wheel wells, but I might favor the sculpt in this department because we kind of resolved some of the design in 3D and ZBrush. So it's time to retopologize this, and to do that we're going to be using a tool called Quad Draw. So let me hide the rest of the space vet. Take this, come up here, and make it live, which is the same thing we did last week to draw our guide curves. But this is going to enable us to draw topology on the surface here. So let's go over to the modeling tools and select Quad Draw. So the way Quad Draw works is you draw these little dots on the surface, and then you hold down Shift and click in the middle and create a face. So now you can see we have the first face of our new mesh. So the way I typically work with this is I draw out my edge loops as I want them, and then I'll kind of connect the topology. With this, for example, I draw a couple more dots, and then I shift click, 2 dots, and shift click. And we can kind of do that around this corner like this. The great part about working on the sculpt is that it's really easy to visualize where your fillets need to be. And the other great thing is that you can hide the sculpt, and since the surface is live, we can move our points around in Quad Draw, and they still stick to the surface. The other thing I do a lot is I will create faces close to where my mesh is, and then I'll kind of drag them away. And that kind of allows us to cover more distance. And then when you hold the Shift key, you can see the little preview for dropping in an edge loop, and then you just click to drop that edge loop in. So it's a quick way to cover ground. I'm going to go ahead and delete that face. If you hover over in Quad Draw and you see a component turn red, you can just hit the delete key. You don't have to click on it. Let me drag these edges over to the center line here, and I'll just add an edge loop there. And since this edge is mostly straight, I'm going to just leave that level of topology for now. If we can cover a lot more distance with less topology, it'll give us more options later when we're connecting all these edge loops together. Similarly, this edge is very straight too, so I'm going to leave it at this lower level. So as we create these faces, if we go farther away from our mesh, you can see that Quad Draw gets a little funky when you're trying to create faces that are far away. But that's because we've created 3 dots, and it's going to try and alternate between the 3 closest dots. So sometimes what I'll do is just create 2 dots to create a new face, and then do the 3rd dot after I've already created the face. So you can see I repeat that process throughout here. And if I'm having trouble getting a face, sometimes I'll just move points so they're closer to my dots. Let me just refine this edge a little bit. And then let's create this face, kind of drag it out further. And then we'll add an edge loop there. So you can see I like to cover a lot of ground with this tool and then add topology afterward. With this shape here along the door, I'm just going to create a loop that kind of hugs around the part line. And What's great about using this tool on a sculpt is that it's a good way to learn about how to make edge loops. So you can see that the edge loops follow around the surfaces, and where there's hard corners, the edge loops kind of intersect with each other, like I mentioned in the first lesson. So since this is a long straight panel, I'm going to just drag that along, and we'll continue up that surface. And now I'll draw some topology around these little vents. So it's a pretty repetitive workflow. You can see how I'll create a face, drag the edge down to cover more distance, and then add an edge loop in later. So now that we have that, I'm going to hit W to get out of quad draw. If you hide the sculpt, you can see what we're working with here. But since I want these features to be a little perfect, we're going to go create some kind of guides for it. So if I turn live surfaces off, and let's go ahead and make an 8-sided cylinder, rotate it by 90 degrees. And I'm just going to kind of line it up with the shape here. And we'll grab these faces on the bottom and extrude, move in object mode, and kind of align it a little better. Then I'll take this object, I'll change this manipulator to world mode, duplicate, and then Shift D to duplicate with transform, which repeats the duplicate command and the transform that I did on the previous object. So now I'll grab these verts, switch back to object mode, and I'll kind of try and match the angle of the lower fender here. And I can use the cut poly tool to kind of see if they're aligned properly, and then just undo. So now that those three are created, I'm going to select my sculpt and make it live again, and then I'll select my new mesh and I'll enable quad draw again. And now I can just kind of move this topology into place and make sure it lines up with my new shapes. So one of the other cool features of quad draw is if you grab topology and move it close to other topology, it will snap them into place. So you can see how I'm simply grabbing these verts and kind of moving them over, and they just snap together. It does the same thing with edges as well. So if I grab this edge and move it up here, you can see that those 2 points have snapped together. That's just kind of one of the handy features when you're using this tool to draw your topology. So I think I'll keep this consistent with the one edge in between. And you can see that now we've deviated a little bit from the sculpt, but it matches the it matches my reference geo pretty well. So now that I've got those, let's continue this edge down here. Kind of just have this edge loop follow around this fillet on the bottom. So I'll create a face and drag it out, and then just add some topology. So for this fender, I'm going to go to the concept cam. Draw some dots on the surface that kind of represent the edge of that fender in the drawing. And now if we look at these in 3D space, we can create an edge loop that represents the flare of this wheel well. Draw our points around that fillet. And then we'll just kind of refine this edge, just to make it look kind of nicer. Let's go to the side view. Might want to scoot these, just kind of scoot these into place. We want these edges to be kind of radial from like a central point. So for this back side, I'm just gonna kind of eyeball that flare. It's not really clear from the concept. And then I'll just go to my top view and refine it a bit. And then I'll make sure that all these points are in the right spot. And I can kind of add these faces to the other side of the fillet here. And continue this edge loop around to the bottom. So let's define this bottom edge. Oops. So it's like I said about the three closest points. You really want to make sure that your dots are close enough together that you create the face you want. So let's create the interior part of this scoop. And I'm just going to kind of expand on the edge loop that I drew before. Draw this edge loop that represents kind of the sidewall of the scoop. And we want an edge loop that wraps around the door, the part line for the door as well. So you can see that that kind of goes across the scoop. Let me just refine this fender a little bit more. I noticed it was a little off. And then I'll just start connecting some of these edge loops together. So this is the part that kind of becomes a bit of a puzzle because you have to make sure that everything lines up. So I'm kind of just visualizing how I want this topology to be. Since this tool is called Quad Draw, it primarily draws quads. You can force it to draw a triangle if you kind of create the faces around that triangle, and then when you shift click, you'll see a purple triangle show up instead of a green quad. But the way to get around that is I will create like a kite shape, and then I'll just drag one of the points and snap it, and that's kind of how I create a triangle. But you can see that one of the triangles I've created now, I've just added this edge loop. And kind of rethinking it. There's that purple triangle I was talking about before. So the more you use this tool, the better you'll get with it. You can see that I did that there. I did that trick again where I create the kite shape, but then I just snap it. Same with that fender there. So I'm going to do a similar thing here, just so I get this kind of consistent edge that kind of wraps around the top of that fender. So let's connect all these together. I'm going to create the quad there and then the triangle. And as I mentioned in the first lesson, since these surfaces won't be deforming like a character, triangles are perfectly acceptable. Because really, when we subdivide this mesh, which is a subdivision mesh, those triangles will become quads anyway. It's n-gons that you really have to worry about. So we definitely want to avoid n-gons. So you can see that, you know, there's areas where I definitely have a lot of topology going into less topology, and using triangles is kind of a good way to get around that problem. No, I don't want to do it that way. So I'm going to add an edge loop up there. If you're finding you're having some trouble connecting some of these shapes, then sometimes it's just necessary to drop in another edge loop. Cool, so now we have kind of the side worked out a little bit. Just kind of even things out a little bit, topology wise. We want nice even spacing between our topology because we don't want any weird surface blemishes or anything. So let's start working on this top surface. Just kind of terminate those points there. You can see that I've created that triangle where they kind of merge together. Let's just create this. Let's create this edge loop kind of along where the hood is, and since I already have this edge loop on the side of the fender, I'll just go ahead and connect them early. So kind of resolving some topology up there. So in this case, I've dragged this face off, and I'll create some edge loops in that long face corresponding to the edge loops on the side of the fender. One thing about this tool, if you hold shift and brush along, you can see that it says relax. That will kind of relax your topology a little bit. So let's create this edge loop that curves around the opening of the hood. Line things up, and then we'll just start connecting our geometry a little more. So as with anything, it's good to work from big to small on these models. So if you can create a big face and then add divisions to it afterward, it's always easier to do that. So I think what I'm going to do is make a part line under the door here. And there we have our completed front fender for now. Let's see if we smooth this. Getting really nice deformation there. Even on this scoop, it looks pretty good. So you can see that if I look in the channel box, there's a lot of history on this object, and Quad Draw is really good at racking up your construction history. So I like to make sure I clear the history quite often. And actually, I just noticed something about this edge here. I don't want it to terminate the way it was terminating, so I want it to kind of have an edge loop that flows along that front face there, and then we can kind of smooth all this out. So that'll give us a much better result around that front corner there. Let's make a few more adjustments to that. Feels like there's kind of inconsistent width on that front lip. So now, any quick way to get out of Quad Draw is just hitting the Q or W key, or any of your other manipulator tools will exit you out of Quad Draw. So that's our front fender. Just kind of must kind of adjust some of these little areas here. So since this is a symmetrical object, I'm going to snap the verts on the center line, and then I'm going to use the mirror tool and mirror along -X. And then we'll call this C front fascia. We will use the suffix SDM because this is a subdivision mesh that we will be smoothing at render time. Alright, so let's quad draw some more. I'll make that surface live, and then if you'll notice if I start quad drawing on this hood that I can draw my dots, but I can't really see where my previous topology was, and a lot of times I'm going to want to line those points up to my topology of my other pieces. So what I'm going to do is turn wireframe on shaded, and when you see here, if I have wireframe on shaded and I have the sculpt and my mesh kind of showing, they're just overlapping each other and it's a big mess. But the cool thing is when you make a surface live, the geometry turns green, so it makes it a little easier to see your topology of your other pieces. So now I can go along this edge loop here and really make sure that the edge of the hood, the topology of the edge of the hood lines up with the topology of the edge of the fender. That'll just give us more predictable results when we're smoothing. So now let me draw out this edge loop around the cowl here. And take that edge all the way to the end. So then we'll connect this edge here, and I could kind of have this edge go over the top of the cowl, but what I'm going to want to do instead is actually create an edge loop that that goes around that kind of corner, and then we'll just create a triangle and terminate that there. So let me add some edge loops that correspond with the side of the hood. And we could create these faces and then just fill in all the gaps, kind of relax the topology. So let me connect those edges, and let's add a loop in the middle, and then we can connect the rest of the edges. And we have an uneven amount, so I'm just going to drop in another edge loop, and then it'll terminate at that triangle there. And then we can kind of go in and relax everything out. Now, it won't relax the open edges of your mesh, so you're going to have to align them kind of by hand. So let's snap the center points to the grid, mirror this, and then you can see we have quite a bit of a gap in between the hood and the fender, or the front fascia. So I'm going to move some verts around, but I'm going to want to move them with symmetry turned on. So if we go to Tool Settings and go to Symmetry Settings, we'll set the symmetry to World X. And then when we grab vertices on this side, you can see that they the corresponding vertices on the other side are selected. So we can then move these verts on the hood and to the side, and these ones, and we have a perfectly symmetrical result. So let's call this C Hood SDM and move on to the next piece. So I'll quickly draw out this piece kind of between the hood and the glass. So I guess the top of the firewall, and just draw out some topology here. Make sure everything's looking good. And one thing I want to point out is that you notice that since I was working with World X symmetry on, it's drawn this topology on both sides of the model, which is really cool. And I actually had no idea that it would do this when I was drawing my other pieces, or I would have done them that way as well. But this is actually really cool. We've got this top of the firewall shape, and we don't have to mirror it across X. But since this piece kind of connects under the cowl, I'm going to want to actually connect it. So since I'll turn symmetry off for now, and then let's grab this edge and use the bridge tool. So the bridge tool will just connect your topology together. If you get weird results with the bridge tool, it might be the order that you've selected of your edges. I usually find that I try to select the same, or the corresponding edges on each side of what I'm trying to bridge. So now I've created that kind of strip that goes along under the cowl. We'll call this C Hood Vent SDM, because we're going to build vents into this in the next lesson. So now let's squad draw our next piece, and let's actually do the door. So I turn on wireframe on shaded again, just so I can draw some topology that lines up with the topology I've already drawn. And I'll quickly just draw out some of these surfaces, and then add edge loops where I'm going to need them. And same here. And I'll turn wireframe on shaded off since we've matched all the topology we can, but it's just difficult to see with wireframe on shaded on. It's like too much information. So since we got this corner of the door here, you can see how I've kind of intersected the two edge loops to create a corner. And now I'm going to connect these edges here and add divisions to create the sort of top surface of the door here. And then I'll drag that edge along, and I'll just snap the 2 points together. And that'll help me to create this door. Top of this door shape. I'll create this edge loop around the top of the window, and I'll create this edge loop along the edge of the kind of scoop shape. And I'll use this triangle to kind of define the shape of the scoop. And then I'll actually connect the edges in this way. I'll leave that triangle in the middle open, and then that'll allow me to kind of throw in these edges here, and then I'll just connect them at the end. So you can see how the points snap together there. So I'll just connect these, connect all these faces together. Actually, I'll create this large face here, and then I can add the topology across. And now I've got this long face, but it's kind of connected topology. And I'll terminate this transition of the scoop into these kind of kite shapes, these diamond shapes. And then I'll connect the faces. I'll create a supporting edge loop near the end of it, and create my triangles and connect the faces, or connect the faces of the side of the scoop, side wall of the scoop. And then you can see it's a constant game of just adjusting topology. So now I can match all these door panels together. Now I'm going to create the shape around this door handle. And you'll see how I'm using triangles to kind of terminate some of those some of that geometry. So you can see how I want that edge loop to continue around the window itself, but I also want it to go across to define the curve of that door. Actually, I'll actually change the topology around in this the front of this door here. The cool thing about Quadra is it's so quick to work with that you can make these sorts of adjustments really fast, and it's a really great way to work. So now let's create the rest of this door frame shape, and you can see I'm going to want to continue these edge loops around that surface. So it's really kind of a curved surface, but what I'm going to do is create the rest of this arch over the door with a single face, and then what I can do is get them kind of close by, and then drop in the supporting edge loops of the edges there, and then just connect everything at the end. That's kind of it's kind of an easy way to work. So if you're having trouble sometimes with creating triangles, you can see there that I went back to edge mode, grabbed the border edge of that open hole in the mesh, and hit the fill hole tool. So that's kind of like a no-nonsense way of filling those triangles. That's my door. I'm going to move some of these points so to close the gap a little bit. We'll do more of this when we're in the later in the lesson as well. Just kind of making things look a little better now. especially these edges we can kind of straighten out. And you'll notice that I'm doing this without the live surface on, but the changes that we're making are so small that it shouldn't be that much of a problem. And so for this, I'm going to do a similar trick that we did with the side vents on the fender, and just sort of line up this this door handle with this kind of extruded cylinder, and I'll just move these points around. The problem with this is that that door handle is on such a complicated surface that I now kind of have to go in and adjust some of these changes that I made just to kind of reintroduce that actual shape of the top of the door. So now we have our L door SDM, and we duplicate that and scale it -1 in X. We now have our right door, so R door SDM. And we're going to create a hierarchy later in the lesson, so we will be deleting the right door, but I just wanted to kind of see how it looked for now. So let me show my sculpt again and make the surface live, and let's do this quarter panel back here. So you can see where we've extended past the mesh in the sculpt. So what we're going to do is draw dots kind of where it looks like the surface ends in the concept art. Looks like that's kind of going to be a little off. We're going to make sure that that edge kind of aligns on the fender there. And let's then draw the dots on that shape of the wheel well as well. So let's start. I'll turn wireframe on shaded on. I'll bring these all back down from smooth preview to polygonal. And then I'll just sort of draw this topology out around this edge of the door. So this edge is actually going to be pretty tricky later because it's such a tight corner. So I drag that edge out, and then I just add in edge loops where I need them. Just kind of continue down this pillar of the front window. So I'm actually going to move these verts so I do the whole shape of the window, and then I can add that edge loop in easier. You can see how we're gonna kind of merge where those edge loops come together. And you can see I've just used triangles to kind of build that out. I'm going into top view to just kind of look where the center point is, so I can add it in there. And then I'm just gonna kind of connect some faces here. So let's build this this lower surface of the quarter panel by the door. This is where you kick to dust your shoes off, I guess. And then let's let's sort of define this. I'll define this wheel well a little better. You can see how finicky that quad draw gets when you're creating topology. So I'll just continue that on to the bottom. Let's just connect some of these faces. And then we'll kind of just rough in that shape of the outer lip of the wheel well. One of the cool things about using switch cam as opposed to just using the front view is it has a clipping plane aspect to it. So if I just looked at the front view with the whole model framed up, I wouldn't be able to see what I'm doing for this rear fender because the front fender would be in the way. But since I've gotten close enough to the model with switch cam, it kind of clips out. You can see the back fender without having the front fender in the way. So I'm going to kind of define this back surface here. I'm just kind of lining up with these where these dots are. So I want this engine bay to kind of be straight across like the top of the window and then go straight back. So I'm going to create it like this. And then if we go to this quad draw tool and scroll down, we can clear the extra dots. So I'm just going to look at this against the concept. And it's a little off, which I think what's going to need to happen is it's either going to need to flare out or it's not far back enough. So when I turn on the rest of the blocking model, you can see that I haven't built this geometry back far enough, that it doesn't cover the whole rear wing. So I'm just going to move some of these features back to a place where it makes a little more sense. And let me continue to draw some of this topology here. Draw these faces and then throw an edge loop. Let's kind of tighten up this edge around the engine bay. Be consistent with our edges of like our hood and stuff. And, so that's looking pretty good. It kind of extends past the wing. And pull it out a little further back. So now let me figure out what I want to do with this, some of this topology here. So I'm starting to get a lot of these edges flying back, but really that curve of that transition with the rear fender and kind of the center of the body is kind of like at this angle. So I'm going to actually follow that curvature and terminate some of these edges into triangles. And since we have that edge loop that surrounds the engine bay, this is going to be fine. And I can kind of throw in the edge there. I'll just throw in these 3 edges. But I'm feeling like this is just still a little too dense here. So I'm gonna terminate those, and then I'll go to edge mode and delete edge vertex those. Now let me figure out this area here. I'll just create some triangles. And it's, part of the puzzle of all this is kind of figuring out how you're going to connect all this topology. So now I need to add this kind of opening for where the wing's going to be. I'm just going to throw in an edge loop to support that back edge, and then we'll just select a bunch of these faces, kind of clean up our selection. And then I'm just going to do an extrude with an offset of 1, maybe 3, and then delete that. Delete those faces, and then I can go in with quad draw and kind of create a good opening for these wings. And then I'll just throw an edge loop around it and kind of spread out that edge loop. And I think I might want to resolve some of this topology a little different. So I'm going to throw in a couple edge loops there. I'll move some of this topology around. Straighten this edge out a little bit. Actually, I think I'm going to delete this edge and kind of go back to more of what I had. Yeah, that looks a little better. I think that would have worked fine from the get-go. For these faces, though, I think I am going to do something a little different because I have more topology that needs to terminate. Cool. Yeah, I see I'm still figuring out what I want to do with this area. Back to quad draw. And now you see we're left with only the 1 triangle there. So that's not too bad. And then I use the shift click to relax some of the components. So now let's snap this to the center. I'll make sure we're in world mode with retain component spacing turned off. And now we have our rear quarter panels. Let's grab these and smooth them out and then look at them with the concept. So you can see the opening for the wing is a little different, but I think we're going to be fine since we lined it up to the wings. We can always go back and adjust this later as well. Excellent. Let's finish these pieces out. Okay, so now that I've created all my shapes with quad draw, and you can see since the last video I've created these glass shapes as well. Let's go ahead and finish modeling them out. So the first thing to do is create the rest of this glass shape since we had the cowl kind of sculpted in. And I'm just going to move these verts in front and kind of down below the surface as well. If we go to Mesh Tools and Sculpting Tools, we actually have some pretty good Maya sculpting brushes. And one of them is a smooth tangent brush, and it'll just kind of smooth out the surface. I think we're starting to lose some of the curvature with it, though. I think it's actually flattening stuff out. So to get a better view, let me assign the glass shader to these pieces, and since it's a blend, it's going to have some more specularity to it than the Lambert shader. So what I'm doing now is just kind of dragging these verts on the edge so that they're kind of underneath where our body panels are going to be, so we don't have a gap in between. And let me do the same for this side window here. And we'll continue to adjust these later when we add some thickness to these panels as well. But for now, let's just kind of crash it through, and that's probably fine. Adjust these kind of ones around the edge, and then kind of fix some of the curvature here. This door panel is kind of tricky because it's kind of this compound curve of the fender, but in the end, I don't think this is going to be a model that the windows are really going to roll down. But that's okay. So you can see I'm doing a little more adjustment here. Just some last adjustments on the curvature of this glass. Okay, so I think it's looking pretty good. Let me assign the body mat to these body panels. And I'm noticing something weird about the hood and front fascia. And I think what's happened here is I haven't built a supporting edge around that crease of the fender. If I take the Sculpt and assign this blend to it, you can see I haven't defined that edge where the kind of the fender and the top surface of the hood intersect, that crescent-shaped crease there. So I'm going to make the Sculpt live again, and I'm just going to go in with Quad Draw and just kind of create that topology. And just really quickly draw it in, and then connect all the geometry together. I don't like that. Let me figure this one out. That's a little better. So let me move on to the hood, and basically what I'm doing is just deleting faces and then kind of adding in the edge along that fillet. And I think we have one edge too many here. So let me adjust this and kind of fix that edge there. And delete the edge that we didn't need. So let me delete it out of the hood as well. So we really only need 2 edge loops kind of surrounding the plane change. And anything extra is kind of unnecessary. So let me add these 3 edges. You can see where we can connect some of these edges. Delete these faces, get them out of our way, and create these edge loops again. Just adjust them into shape. Let's go ahead and continue there. And I'll just kind of have this edge loop terminate in that corner a little bit. But now you can see that we're getting that crease a lot better. Let me continue it up here in this in the fender area. You see, I want to maintain that edge loop. Around the edge of the hood to make sure that edge of the hood stays sharp. So that's looking pretty good. And since we had symmetry on, we got both sides for free, so that's really cool. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude this edge down, and we'll do -0.5. It'll give that surface the appearance of thickness. And then, actually, before I do the hood, I'm going to use a lattice and take that down to 2. And we're just going to kind of reshape the cowl to kind of hug the glass a little better. And then I'll just go in and manually kind of average out some of the topology, and then I'll grab everything, and then we'll just add our same thickness to it, -0.5. So now when I smooth these things, you can see that I've got quite a bit of gap there. So I'm definitely going to want to close that gap up. So let me go to side view for when I do the front here, and you can see how close I'm wanting to get here. I'll grab these verts on the side. Let's kind of move them in. Actually, I'm going to go, I'll go one by one and make sure they're all lining up properly. The thing about quad draw is it's a little imprecise, so you do kind of have to go in and fix some things after the fact. That's all just part of modeling. So now what I'm going to do for this inner edge of the hood is I'm going to extrude this edge of the front fascia in so it creates kind of a lip for the hood to sit on. I'm going to go in and fix these points so they kind of align. And yeah, let me extrude these vents in. I'll extrude them in by 1 just to give it a little more thickness, like it's a little more intentional. Kind of space some of that out. And now I'm going to grab from this edge to this edge and extrude down, and then I'll merge our two our verts. But for this fender piece here, we want to create like the outer lip of it before we add some thickness. So I'm just going to extrude and scale it, and then kind of just eyeball the thickness that I want. And then what we can do is add an edge loop to give it the kind of a sharper edge. That looks pretty good. We'll need to do the same with the back fender later. Add an edge loop in there. Oh, I guess. And then I'll grab from this edge to the other side, and then I'll make our extrusion of -0.5. Merge our two hanging verts together, and now when we smooth, we've got front fascia and hood that have thickness. So let's do the same with the door. I'll grab this door handle edge, or I'll grab the outer edge of the door and extrude and add our -0.5 thickness. And then Let's kind of move our verts into place. So everything's a little closer to the front fascia. Probably move that whole edge down at once. Need to go in a little bit with that. And actually, I think I should do that after I extrude the quarter panel in. So let me grab this. Okay. Make sure I only want to grab from there to there. I'll do our extrude -0.5. And then I'll fix the door first, actually. And then I'm kind of just doing this in perspective view and looking at the piece head on and adjusting. Now for this this back part, I want to make sure that I'm not selecting any of those edges around the door handle. I'll just drag it back and kind of scoot it into place. I'll extrude down this door handle, -0.5. But for this inside of the window, I'm just going to extrude this in by -1. I'm going to intersect the glass with this edge. Actually, what I'm going to do is create an edge loop and turn wireframe on shaded off, and I'm going to want the glass to kind of intersect on that edge loop, so we have like kind of this perfect thickness around the glass. So I'll just move some of these verts into place. And make sure that they line up with that edge loop that I added. And yeah, it's looking pretty good. Just move that a little bit. And you saw me use the slide edge tool there. Sometimes if I feel topology is bunching up a little bit, I'll just slide the edges along and kind of adjust them. You fix the curvature on this glass. I need to add that edge because we're getting kind of that weird folded face look. That looks a little better. And delete the right side door because we're going to reduplicate. So for this piece along the top of the door, I want to actually move the quarter panel down to meet the door. So you saw what I did there was delete that edge, and then I was able to add an edge loop that ended right there because it won't go past the end gon, and then kind of added this extra edge to support the edge of the door. Just move these all into place. It's looking pretty good. Move everything a little bit. So I deleted that inner edge And we're going to use the same trick as we did with the other side window, is extrude down by 1 instead of 0.5, and then add an edge loop. And then I'm going to just intersect that glass with that edge loop to make sure we've got an even thickness around the edge of it. So just making sure that everything's intersecting properly. Now, this front surface of the glass, let me actually just merge these verts to center. And we'll leave it like that. But this front edge of the glass, I don't really want to change too much. So what I'm going to do is, to resolve this, I'm going to figure out this fender geometry a little better. So that kind of continues our edge a little bit. That looks pretty good. And it kind of meets up with the glass a little better. So I'm going to do the same thing with this piece. You can see that we're not aligned with the glass at the front anyway. I'm just going to move this back, and we're just going to kind of line everything up. And grab this edge and move it up against the glass. So I'm going to extrude this back by 1 and add an edge loop like we did with the rest of the surfaces that meet the glass. But instead of moving the glass down, I'm going to actually move this surface up to kind of meet the curvature of the glass. And we'll refine it a little bit. You see, I kind of want it to bow up into this curve of the glass, so I'm just kind of adjusting from the front view. And then maybe move it forward a bit to meet the hood a little better. And over this way. Excellent. So now we have this piece that meets up with the glass. So it looks like something happened to this door panel. I must have had something selected at some point and accidentally moved some points around. But it looks like if I just move these verts back out, everything appears to be okay. Just kind of recreate that curvature of that surface there. So let me add these supporting edges around where the scoop goes. And awesome. Let me turn wireframe on shaded off. And I'll move this, the corners of this, so it doesn't just flow downward. And that's pretty much it for the surfaces we created this week. So this is about the level of completion I'm expecting for this week. I definitely would like to see your retopologized body panels. I'd like to see your sculpt, both so I can gauge the forms of your model, but also so I can see your decimated topology. And finally, I'd also like to see, in addition to your hierarchy from last week, a new hierarchy with proper naming conventions that include the mesh location and the mesh type. So far, we're only dealing with subdivision meshes, so they should all have a suffix of SDM. I hope you enjoy using this workflow this week. To be completely honest, it's pretty rare that I get to sculpt anything in production, but I couldn't tell you the amount of times I've had to retopologize a model I've gotten from art department. QuadDraw in Maya is an extremely versatile tool, and I know it's going to serve you over and over again in your career. So that's all for this week. I hope you have a lot of fun sculpting and retopologizing.